What's good, fire starters? Welcome to the second episode of Into the Fire, a podcast where we talk about the psychological and mental health issues that are plaguing the artist community right now. I'm Alex, and I want to open up your mind to what really goes on under the hood of creatives. Let's go! So I've always been interested in why some of my favorite musicians, artists, poets have been a little bit crazy. And by that, I mean they've dealt with mental illness or alcoholism or drug use or suicide. Especially, from the previous episode we had looking at Avicii and Kurt Cobain and various other musicians that have killed themselves as of late. And it's one of the reasons why I went into psychology. I've always had an affinity for music. I played a lot of instruments from a young age. And when I needed to pick a subject in college, psychology was it, because I wanted to become a musician, but I was kind of hesitant because I saw all of the issues that musicians that I liked were going through. And it kind of actually diverted me from following music more. It sounds like a cop-out, but I don't know. I just, the life of a musician, a touring musician, didn't seem as great to me. It just seemed like they all had issues. So I pursued more of an academic route and wanted to find out why that was going on. And so here we are now, that I'm doing both. I'm a musician behind the scenes. I do, mixing, mastering, ghost production. But I'm also, still interested in why like some of my favorite poets, like Sylvia Plath or Edgar Allan Poe, musicians, Kurt Cobain, Avicii, right? And artists like, Van Gogh, like all of these individuals had serious issues. And this isn't to say that, most artists are fucked up in the head, to be blunt, but a lot of them are. And that's the point of this book that I read called Touch with Fyre, Manic-depressive Illness and the Artistic Temperament by Kay Redfield Jamison. And basically she looks at a lot of research and biographies of artists in recent history and tries to explain why many had manic-depressive illness, which we now call bipolar disorder. So I'm going to be interchanging back and forth between the two names because she uses manic-depressive illness for a lot of people in history, but now we now call it bipolar disorder for various reasons. But bipolar disorder basically consists of manic episodes that may include symptoms such as high energy, reduced need for sleep, and loss of touch with reality, and includes also depressive episodes, which may include symptoms such as low energy, low motivation, and loss of interest in activities. These episodes can last for months at a time, also can be associated with suicidal thoughts, and treatment is usually lifelong and consists of medication and psychotherapy. So I even today as an artist, sometimes I wonder if having a thing about you, which just isn't like everyone else. Like, I feel like as an artist, you kind of see things a little differently than the, I guess, normal person. That sounds weird, but I feel like as an artist, you kind of have to see things through a different lens in order to express yourself. And so this book was pretty awesome for me, and I hope I can illuminate some things for you if you've ever wondered what goes on inside the head of some of the most famous artists in history, and if being bipolar can help in your art. That sounds like a ridiculous statement, but stick with me here. So one of the tenets of being bipolar is that most of the time you seem normal. right? Aren't like most of the time you aren't displaying any mania or depressive states, right? So that's one of the things that seems to be the hallmark of a lot of mental illness that's been affecting a lot of artists, is that most of the time they aren't displaying it. Like with Anthony Bourdain, like a lot of people are shocked that he killed himself. And I'm not trying to connect the dots here, but and say that he had bipolar disorder, but a lot of mental illness is kind of latent. People can hide it pretty well, or it's just it happens not as often as you would think. Like we think of people who have mental illness as someone who's like, it's pretty obvious, right? Like that person there's something not right. But a lot of times, like especially with bipolar disorder, it's not, you don't see it in the person. They seem relatively normal. By the way, Kay Redfield Jamison, quickly, she's a clinical psychologist, and she's a professor of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins University. And what she says in the beginning with her book is that there is, in fact, strong scientific and biographical evidence linking manic-depressive illness to artistic imagination and expression. She wants to make the point, though, that a lot of artists have no family history of being bipolar. And so this isn't like a book to say that you have to be bipolar to be a good artist, or that the majority of artists are bipolar. What she's saying is that there's a correlation, that a greatly disproportionate number of artists are bipolar, and that needs to be examined as to why this is happening and how we're to go about treating it. She actually explains later whether we should be prescribing drugs for people with manic depressive disorder to dull their senses, right? To kind of make them more neutral. And she explores whether that would hinder one's creativity and artistic expression. And I think that's super interesting. And we'll go into that later on. She looks at one study that took a lifetime creativity scale and found that artistic groups, when compared with the expected rates for suicide and mood disorders, were 18 times likely to commit suicide, 8 to 10 times more likely to have major depressive illness, and 10 to 40 times more likely to be bipolar, which I thought was ridiculous. So there's definitely a link. The link, she says, the link between madness and genius is one of the oldest and most persistent cultural notions, and it's also the most controversial. And I thought that was really cool that this is a notion that's been discussed by philosophers throughout history, but hasn't really been looked at from a scientific lens until somewhat recently. And she goes into how Plato and Socrates discussed how priests and poets communicated with gods through inspired madness and sacred enthusiasms. Divine madness and inspiration were thought obtainable only during particular states of mind, such as loss of consciousness, affliction with illness, madness, or states of possession. Socrates, in a speech on divine madness, said, "Madness, provided it comes as the gift of heaven, is the channel by which we receive the greatest blessings. Madness is a nobler thing than sober sense. Madness comes from God, whereas sober sense is merely human." It's fascinating to hear this from, arguably the two most famous philosophers in history, right? Plato, Socrates. She even quotes Aristotle. I mean, that would be my top three. But they were exploring the link between madness, you could translate as mental illness, and creative expression. And I think that was awesome because I have a master's in psychology, but also one in philosophy. I've always loved philosophy, and I don't recall ever reading about this in any of my graduate courses in philosophy. There's actually a lot that I've been reading on lately independently through books that was never discussed in my graduate studies, but that's a different topic for a different day. So as early as the 1940s, I guess in the United States, we were looking at this phenomenon finally in a research setting. And so during then, there was a study of more than 5,000 individuals, and they found that the highest rates of psychiatric abnormality were found in poets, which was 50%, and then musicians. So poets had a 50% chance that they had psychiatric abnormality, and musicians had a 38% chance. Painters were 20%, sculptors 18%. This was super interesting because I don't know, I studied English lit as a bachelor's degree, and I loved poetry. I've always loved poetry, but and I don't know why I've always kind of liked the dark stuff. I mean, Edgar Allan Poe was amazing to me, but from reading this book, I could tell that a lot of poets in particular deal with mental illness, depression, first and foremost. But musicians are not too far behind. And as a musician right now, I think this is super relevant to me and to a lot of the listeners out there. And, almost 40% in this study, that's a large percentage. So this, I mean, just look at what's been happening lately with musicians committing suicide. I don't want to go, completely out of bounds and say that they all had bipolar disorder. But like I said, one of the descriptors of bipolar disorder is that for the most part, these individuals aren't displaying outward effects. It's only certain periods of time. And so I don't know. It would be an interesting thing to look more into. I would have to look at the biographies really of the recent people who have committed suicide. Chris Cornell, Chester Bennington, and Avicii. But it's interesting to think about whether they had bipolar disorder and just hadn't been diagnosed with it. Only 1/3 of effectively ill patients actually make a mental health visit ever. That means that 2/3 of people with serious mental health issues are never going to see a mental health professional. That's crazy that 2/3 of individuals in our society that have mental illness are never going to visit a mental health professional. And that is a great topic for another day, another episode, is why we don't seek out mental health professionals and therapists. There's so many reasons, and I think that'll be a great topic to go into further. So people who are bipolar, they tend to drink and use drugs to excess more, and they're far more likely to commit suicide than individuals in any other psychiatric or medical risk group. And the most important part here is that the mortality rate for untreated bipolar illness is higher than it is for many types of heart disease and cancer. I don't know, that to me just like highlights how important this is. Like in another study in Sweden, they found that suicide was almost 80 times more likely among patients with depressive illness than those with no psychiatric disorder. So after hearing all of this information, you'd be like, well, there's nothing good about being bipolar. There's nothing good that can come out of mania and depressive bouts, right? But the author goes into how if you can channel it properly, and this is something I've also been interested in, is if you can channel this like mania, these super highs and these super lows, if you can channel that into your art, it can be really amazing. She gives the metaphor of a skin diver with a breathing tube, like you're snorkeling, right? And you're going deep into the depths of intense emotion, but you still have that breathing tube that's poking up at the surface. Like you go deep, but you don't lose yourself completely. She also says that, some skin divers are prone to fall victims to the rapture of the deep, and they tear off their breathing tubes. I thought that was really interesting. I just love this metaphor. She says the capacity to regress more or less at will to the games of the underground without losing contact with the surface seems to be the essence of the poetic and of any other form of creativity. I think that's really cool. I think that's something I want to look into more as well. A lot of art to me comes from pain, from struggle, from darkness. A lot of the art that I like, and not to say I'm a dark person, I like angry, dark stuff sometimes, like Nine Inch Nails, Rage Against the Machine, if you want to go like way, way, way back, right? And I don't think that, Trent Reznor's still alive. Like Rage Against the Machine, they're not overdosing and committing suicide. Like, I really feel like you can channel this rage, you can channel this like really dark expression about you and still come back to the surface, right? So I don't know where I could go with that in the future, but that would be awesome if I could even teach that, like how to channel your creativity in a really extreme way, but then not lose yourself completely, right? And just go off into the complete depths and be able to come back to reality. So she says the integration of these deeper, truly irrational sources with more logical processes can be a torturous task. But if successful, the resulting work often bears a unique stamp, a touch of Fyre for what it has been through. That is so dope to me.